I'd like to welcome you to the AAUW Jane Addams program, which we're having this evening on Edith the Rogue Rockefeller McCormick. I'm Harriet Lindstrom from the Downers Grove branch of AAUW. Elaine Fisher, who usually moderates, will be joining us a little bit later in the program. But we're delighted that you could attend. We have a large group. I'd like to thank the AAUW of Illinois, who provided the grant so that we could have these online programs for the Jane Addams branch. And we'd also like to have you all consider, if you're not already, joining the AAUW Jane Addams branch. There'll be more information on that a little bit later, where you can get a discount membership. Keep in mind the chat window, and if you have any questions during the conversation this evening, write your questions in the chat, or if you have any tech issues, you can write them there. And we want to make sure that you all stay muted during the program so that we can all thoroughly enjoy the presentation. And we are recording the program, and it will later be on the Jane Addams website. Our speaker tonight is Andrea Friederici Ross, and she's a writer who explores her thoughts to make sense of the world. I believe she grew up in the suburban area, graduate of Northwestern University with a bachelor's in German language and literature. She's the author of 2 books and blog posts. One of the books, not the one that she's going to talk about tonight, but is called Let the Lions Roar, and it's the evolution of the Brookfield Zoo. She's currently working in a grade school library, and one of her goals is to make sure all young people have a passion for reading. And she personally is very passionate about nature, children, travel, dog rescue, and chocolate. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Andrea Ross.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. Appreciate that. Let me get my screen up here. All right, give me just 1 second. All right, there we go.
Good.
All right. All right. That looks okay, right? Nothing blocking the view there. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm so pleased to have this opportunity to introduce Edith Rockefeller McCormick to you. I first became aware of Edith many years ago when I wrote Brookfield Zoo's history book, Let the Lions Roar. I knew that she was an unusual person with very unconventional beliefs, but it took me a solid 10 years to write this book and to try to sort out fact from fiction in her case. There are many books about Edith's father, John D. Rockefeller, the oil tycoon, and her brother, the great philanthropist. But information on Edith is scattered, scant. Many historians believe that Edith's papers were destroyed after her death. Piecing together her life was a bit of a scavenger hunt, collecting a few letters of correspondence here, some recollections from friends or family there, and scouring newspaper accounts and steamer manifests until I gradually assembled a more complete picture of this enigmatic woman. Growing up Rockefeller wasn't what you would think. Bessie, Alta, Edith, and John D. Jr. grew up first in Cleveland and then later in New York City. Their lives were filled with prayer, study, duty. For her mother and father, both devout Baptists, the priority was serving the Lord and keeping personal desires in check. Her mother's favorite maxim was, "Is it right? Is it duty?" The children likely had no idea of their family's incredible wealth. They earned pennies by catching flies, pulling weeds, practicing music, and they had to account for every penny. The money was intended for the church plate, not for spending. As a little girl, every hour of Edith's day was scheduled and efficiently occupied. That was a habit that would stay with her. But the piety, the diligence, and the constant denial, that would have lifelong repercussions. And there was fear. Once the family settled in New York City, and Edith was in her teen years, the hate began to seep in. As one of the nation's richest men, John D. Rockefeller received tremendous amounts of mail requesting financial help from organizations and individuals in dire circumstances. And mixed in with these pleas for assistance were hate letters and threats. Strangers camped out on their doorstep or followed their father to work. And due to his ruthless business practices, there were front page cartoons lampooning him. Edith began to learn that the world was a scary place. All of the siblings and the parents developed nervous ailments, and a lifelong processional in and out of sanatoriums began in order to treat their headaches, shattered nerves, and digestive ailments. In piecing together Edith's life, it's helpful to look at what other biographers have written about the male members of her family, the women not having received much attention thus far. John D. Rockefeller biographer Ron Chernow writes, Jr. developed an upside-down worldview in which the righteous Rockefeller household was always under attack by a godless, uncomprehending world. The same rings true for Edith. Education was prized in the family. Books were safe. Learning was safe. In later years, Edith was quoted as saying that reading was more important to me than eating. I must feed my mind more than my body. As I researched, it became obvious that while the family was close-knit and the three daughters were clearly loved, it was Edith's brother, Jr., who always got the best of everything. The only son, the heir apparent. When Jr. was a teenager, father created a private school for him and other like-minded young men. Two of the boys who joined Jr. in these studies were Harold and Stanley McCormick, sons of Cyrus McCormick, the Reaper King. And young Harold, blue-eyed, fun-loving, whistling, captured Edith's fancy and slowly became part of the family. They married in November of 1895. The wedding did not go as planned, not even remotely. The details for that story are best saved for another day, but I'll just share with you that Harold came down with pleurisy, and instead of the large church wedding that Edith had been planning, they wed in his small hotel suite. And though the ceremony was planned for noon, a sudden fierce storm turned the New York City sky dark as midnight, and the rain fell in torrents, thunder and lightning seeming to express Mother Nature's displeasure. It wasn't the grandest of starts. The newlyweds spent 3 years in Council Bluffs, Iowa, where Harold learned the family business at McCormick Harvester. Years later, Edith would reflect on this time as perhaps the happiest in her life. She set about creating a household, ordering monogrammed handkerchiefs and linens, hiring staff, and beginning her assemblage of priceless antiques. Finally allowed to spend money, she did so with gusto. Harold seemed to enjoy his work as salesman, putting his gregarious nature to good work. Their first child, John Rockefeller McCormick, was born in Iowa. Then they moved to Chicago, where a second son, Harold Fowler McCormick Jr., to be called Fowler, was born. They purchased a home on the north side of the city, which was dubbed McCormickville. because so many of the relatives lived there, including Harold's mother, sister, and brother. The address was 1000 Lakeshore Drive. She called it the Bastion. It had a massive ornamental gate surrounding the property. It felt secure, truly secure. She could lock out the world. Harold and Edith set out to make it a showplace, working with antique dealers to gather an astounding collection of treasures. One of Edith's prized possessions was the gilded silver dinner service that Napoleon gave to his sister upon her marriage to the Prince Borghese. 1,600 pieces with a Borghese coat of arms. She had the entire set. She had some of Napoleon's actual chairs, too, in the dining room with his initials. Her bedroom was decorated in Louis XVI, from the large canopy bed to the gilded dressing table and an elegant carved writing table. Her collection of fine laces was museum quality, primarily Flemish and Italian, many dating back to the 15th century. And her jewels. She had some of the Russian crown jewels, 10 of Catherine the Great's emeralds spaced between some 1,000 diamonds. I don't have a picture of that, I wish I did. Her pearls, perfectly matched, were later appraised at $2 million. Edith's grand plan was to turn her house into a museum after her death. She was amassing these treasures, bringing them to this country so that Chicago could have these showpieces. But in the meantime, she would enjoy them. Edith and Harold had a summer home built in Lake Forest, an Italian villa overlooking the lake. Sadly, because of events about to unfurl, this magnificent home, which they called Villa Turicum, would never really be lived in. Harold's great passion at the time was aviation. A true McCormick, he loved to tinker, and he worked with leading aviators to produce a few aircraft designs himself, including an umbrella plane and something he called the mustard plaster. Harold helped to organize the first international aviation meet in Chicago in 1909. An event at which many Chicagoans got their first glimpse at airplanes. Sadly, many also witnessed tragedy as 2 pilots fell to their deaths attempting stunts. The money was flowing out. Jewels, antiques, portraits of both her and Harold, tapestries, and donations, so many donations. While her father and brother were primarily focused on education and medicine for their philanthropies at that time, Edith's focus was the arts, music, theater, art, and most notably, opera. Edith and Harold were among a group of city leaders who spearheaded efforts to create a resident opera company in Chicago. They poured huge amounts of money into the endeavor, often fronting the ticket revenue at the beginning of the season to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. It was a daunting undertaking. In the first season, 1909-1910, they performed 21 different operas, most only 2 or 3 times. That first season was very nearly derailed when soprano Mary Garden gave such a seductive rendition of Salome that the police chief threatened to shut them down. It would have fallen to Harold as president of the opera to confront the diva, but Edith took that upon herself, informing Mary Garden that she had attended all of the performances thus far and that my vibrations are all wrong. The remainder of the scheduled performances were canceled. End of discussion. In Edith's own words, it is only the cities which have reached a certain cultural height which have opera. From my point of view, opera is a proof of culture and therefore not to be considered as a luxury, but to be recognized as a biological necessity. For human development is measured by culture. Where there is no culture, there is no actual development. It was a busy time. Edith and Harold were among a handful of guarantors who backed the purchase price for the new orchestra hall, giving a permanent home to Theodore Thomas's new resident orchestra. And Edith, alongside Jane Addams and others, helped found the Three Arts Club, which offered dormitory rooms and dining facilities for struggling young female artists. By now, Edith's house, the Bastion, was full. There was a bustling contingent of 17 servants working for the family, cooks, sewing ladies, charwomen, footmen, chauffeurs, and nurses and governesses for the children. Edith and Harold had 5 children in total. Firstborn Jack and his brother Fowler would later be joined by 3 girls, Muriel, Editha, and Mathilde. But delighted though they were with these descendants, it was likely the children that caused Edith's life to take a sharp turn. In 1902, Jack suddenly died of scarlet fever, and just a few years later, baby Editha passed away before her first birthday. For Edith, these deaths aggravated the fears that she'd been suppressing since childhood. She'd always been wary of the outside world, strangers, noise, commotion. They had had threats of abduction and death. All of her siblings suffered nervous disorders, but these very real horrors came from inside. Nothing was safe. Another real threat for the McCormicks was mental illness. 2 of Harold's siblings had succumbed to madness. His older sister, Mary Virginia, suffered a mental break in her late teens, to which Harold had a front row seat. And despite their mother's horror at having to do so, was eventually institutionalized for the rest of her life. And Harold's brother, Stanley, seen here with his bride, Catherine Dexter, brilliant, full of promise, and destined for a life in the harvester business. So close in age to Harold that they had been raised essentially as twins, had been showing signs of emotional instability for some time. In 1904, right after his wedding to Catherine Dexter, Stanley suffered a critical emotional break. Sent first to Boston's McLean's Hospital and later installed in a family estate built in California named Riven Rock, which is where Harry and Meghan live now, by the way, Stanley was diagnosed with dementia praecox, now known as schizophrenia, and vacillated between bouts of catatonia, bursts of aggression, and occasional periods of lucidity. Doctors surmised that it was the pressure of his marriage to Catherine that caused the break, and she was never able to spend time with him again. Catherine, the first woman to graduate from MIT with a degree in biology, argued for decades for endocrine testing, but Stanley's doctors pushed her aside. Edith's sister Bessie suffered as well, forcing her husband, brilliant philosopher Charles Strong, to witness as she babbled incoherently and worried endlessly and needlessly of impoverishment. Bessie died in 1904 following a stroke. Surely they must have worried about who would be next. And while now oldest child Fowler seemed healthy in all aspects, daughter Muriel had a volatile personality, prone to extreme outbursts of temper, and youngest daughter Mathilde suffered from respiratory difficulties from birth and required special treatment. There was plenty of worry to go around. And meanwhile, President McKinley was assassinated. Meanwhile, journalist Ida Tarbell wrote a scathing series about John Dee in McClure's magazine. Meanwhile, over 600 people died in the Iroquois theater fire in Chicago. And meanwhile, the Titanic sank. Disillusioned with the treatment that she had received at a variety of sanatoriums over her life, Edith traveled to Zurich for treatment under a yet little-known analyst named Carl Jung. What was intended to be a stay of just a few months would grow into 8 years. Edith thrived in Zurich, freed from her social commitments, no longer responsible for 2 households or her family. Her son Fowler was at Grouten, her daughter Mathilde at a sanatorium in the mountains of Davos, and her other daughter was overseen in Zurich by her governess. Edith was able to focus on herself. Jung suggested a course of academic study for Edith. She took to this like a fish to water. The bulk of her time in Switzerland would be spent learning. It was quite a diverse program of studies, including languages, history, philosophy, astronomy, music, and biology, with professors from the University of Zurich who conducted private lessons with her in the hotel. After Edith's death, an independent scholar analyzed her personal library. It contained over 15,000 volumes, enough to rival some university libraries at the time, and a tremendous collection of Kant, Nietzsche, and Goethe. A skilled linguist, Edith always read in the author's native language and made notes in the margins in that language. It appeared that this study, which she kept up for the remainder of her life, was begun in Zurich. It is possible that Edith did more for Jung than he did for her. She became one of his greatest financial supporters, underwriting translations of his writings into English and other languages, as well as providing space for use as a psychological club, where followers of Jung's methods could attend lectures, socialize, and interact. Perhaps in exchange for Edith's generosity, or perhaps because he genuinely believed she understood his methods and philosophies, Jung anointed her as analyst. She also supported artists who had taken refuge in neutral Switzerland, in addition to composers such as Otto Lüning and Philipp Jarnach. Edith underwrote James Joyce for 1.5 years as he wrote Ulysses. There were other aspects to Edith and Harold's life in Switzerland. Harold had been appointed a procurement officer for the war, handling requests for supplies. Word was out that the McCormicks were in town, and they were bombarded with financial requests, such as when they hosted 59 POWs for dinner at the Hotel Bar Olak. The men had been captured and thrown aboard the steamer Yarrowdale as prisoners and subsequently spent 3 months in a prison camp. The McCormicks also provided 50 francs and new clothing for each man. The McCormicks also donated generously towards a project in Parma, Italy, the construction of a massive arch to celebrate the centennial of composer Giuseppe Verdi's birth. Sadly, the arch was badly damaged during the Second World War and no longer stands. But the most dramatic event that they may have been involved with involved a French flying ace. Lieutenant Eugene Gilbert had been forced to make an emergency landing on Swiss soil. He was kept under guard in a barracks in Zurich. But one night, guard mysteriously wandered off, leaving Gilbert unattended. A getaway car whisked him to Lausanne, then a high-speed motorboat rushed him over Lake Geneva to Evian, a French city on the far side. While nothing could be proven as to the McCormicks' involvement, with Harold's interest in aviation and all manner of speedy vehicles, there was much speculation. Furthermore, Gilbert had been seen in their company at the hotel. Harold, who had traveled back and forth between Zurich and Chicago repeatedly, returned to Chicago in 1918 to fully assume his role at the helm of International Harvester. And this was when the family really began to fall apart. In a story worthy of its own opera, and in fact, it would serve as the basis for the love triangle in the movie Citizen Kane, an aspiring opera singer tracked down Harold in search of a part with the Chicago Grand Opera, and in no time at all, he was smitten. Her name was Gana Volska, and that was a stage name. Hideous voice, but beautiful. She'd just been widowed by her second husband, a wealthy New York doctor. Having met Gana in New York and started some sort of relationship in the States, Harold engineered to cross the Atlantic aboard the same steamer, the Aquitania. Also on board was bachelor Alexander Smith Cochrane, the Carpet King. Both Harold and Smith Cochrane wooed Gana on board, with Harold asking if she would marry him if he were single. She declined. Harold continued on to Zurich and begged Edith for a divorce. She refused. He persisted, and eventually Edith acquiesced. Harold rushed to Paris to tell Gana the good news, only to find that she had married the Carpet King in the meantime. Brokenhearted, he wrote, "I am suffering, I am tortured." He returned to Zurich to patch up his ailing marriage. It was at this point that, after 8 years in Switzerland, despite fairly crippling travel phobias, Edith finally managed to return to the States. She brought back a friend from Zurich, Edwin Krenn, a young Austrian who claimed to be an architect. He had come to Zurich for analysis and developed a lifelong relationship with Edith. Whether they were lovers or friends would be the subject of considerable conjecture for years to come. But whatever their relationship, Edwin would be the loyal friend that Edith had lacked so far. Edith intended to visit her father in New York after disembarking the steamer, but he refused to welcome Edwin. After several rounds of telegrams, Edith would return to Chicago without having seen her father. He didn't approve of her time with Jung, of her having abandoned his Baptist beliefs, or of her new friend. There were considerable challenges for Edith. Despite the fact that she had returned to the States in the hopes of mending the relationship, Harold wanted a divorce, and he assembled a powerhouse legal team, including Clarence Darrow. The financial settlement, in which Edith had to buy Harold out of both of their houses, would be a staggering financial blow to her for years. Harold was still hoping to snag Gana Volska, whose marriage, her third, to the Carpet King, had fallen apart. In preparation for his union with this younger woman, he underwent a controversial gland transplant intended to rejuvenate his libido. He swore everyone to secrecy, but someone had tapped his phone lines, and soon it was front page news across the country. He was subsequently asked to resign from International Harvester, which he did, before traveling to Europe to marry Gana. Another challenge for Edith was that her youngest daughter, Mathilde, who had been raised primarily in the Davos sanatorium, had fallen in love with her riding instructor, Max Ozer, a Swiss gentleman, roughly 30 years her senior. 18-year-old Mathilde did marry Max, much to Edith's dismay, and that was front page news as well. Edith's life after returning from Zurich was markedly different than pre-1913. She entertained far less frequently, and generally only when special guests, such as Prince William of Sweden or Queen Marie of Romania, were in town. Her entertainment consisted of opera, chamber musics, chamber concerts, theater, and that new diversion, movies. The newspapers followed her movements closely and always reported on where she went, who she was with, usually Edwin, and what she wore. On one occasion, she made the reporters giddy when she announced at a dinner party that she was the reincarnation of Anka Essen-Paaten, King Tut's child bride. Having given land to the Cook County Forest Preserve District for the express purpose of building a zoo, Edith would become the godmother of Brookfield Zoo, although she was only marginally involved with the actual planning. She also sat on the planning board for the Women's World Fairs, which took place in the mid-1920s. She was considered the keenly intellectual member of the group. But her main enterprise was her own real estate firm, which she started with Edwin and an old Ukrainian friend of his, Edward Dado. Edith provided the funds for Kren and Dado, and Edwin and Edward handled the business end. They started with one salesman, a taxi driver, who sold lots that Edith owned adjacent to what was to become Brookfield Zoo. But within a couple of years, they'd grown to one of the nation's largest real estate firms, employing hundreds of real estate agents. They sold lots to over 16,000 Chicagoans for over $26 million. They even started plans for a utopian community near Kenosha, Edithton. While the blueprints called for luxury living on the lake, it also included plans for a national university, a place where professors from colleges around the country could come in the summer to learn from each other and recharge their batteries. It included its own radio station and airport, as well as sporting facilities large enough to host future Olympic Games. Sadly, it would never be built. Edith had carved out a new life for herself, despite the shame of the divorce, Harold's scandalous surgery, and the fact that her family had abandoned her. Her children siding with Harold, and her father and brother disapproving of her life choices. Edith's story does not end well. When the real estate market slowed in 1927, followed by the stock market crash of 1929, she was left holding thousands of acres of land no one would buy. Many of her investors defaulted on their mortgages, and instead of evicting them, she absorbed the blow herself. Due to the terrible divorce settlement and the unforeseeable national crash, Edith was left begging her father and brother for funds. They refused, saying time and again, "We regret it would not be in your best interest for us to provide this assistance." Breast cancer delivered the final blow for Edith. A month before her death, Edith's brother set her up in a suite at the Drake Hotel, provided that she fire her staffs and close up her two houses. I believe that she could see the bastion out her window. Edith died in August 1932 at the age of 59. On the day of her funeral, thousands lined the streets to honor Chicago's patron saint. Her brother and family must have been stunned to see the affection for Edith, the acknowledgement of all that she had given to the city: opera, a zoo, community theater, real estate. An infectious diseases institute that she and Harold founded after their first son Jack's death helped curb scarlet fever. Her first will had stated that her home was to become the Rockefeller McCormick Museum of Chicago, which institution shall be a gallery of art, a museum of antiquities, and other rare and beautiful articles, in order that it may aid in encouraging and developing the study of the fine arts and of advancing the general knowledge of kindred subjects. However, due to the debts that she had incurred, her carefully collected belongings were auctioned off, sold for pennies on the dollar during the Depression. The museums were not to be. Some historians believe that Edith's papers were destroyed after her death, perhaps by Harold and her brother, Jr. I can't prove this to be true, but I can attest to the fact that while the other family members, including the women, have large collections in the family archives, Edith's files are quite limited. As a woman with markedly different beliefs and interests than the men around her, it seems that they may have erased her tracks. Had she been born male, Edith's life trajectory would have been different from the get-go. As it was, She did what she could to elevate her adopted city of Chicago to a vital city with more cultural and artistic offerings. Though her name has largely disappeared from our history books, many of us here in Chicago have benefited from her lasting gifts. Thank you so much for this opportunity to present Edith to you as a forgotten woman of Chicago. I would love to answer any questions that you may have. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so that I can see people as we have this conversation. So I'm not sure who is monitoring the chat. Somebody is.
Thank you so much for that story. This could definitely be a movie.
I've heard that
Although
before.
it's a very, very dramatic, very sad story. Why did you decide that her story was important to write this book about?
Well, so it started with less noble, with less noble plans, shall we say. I had just read the book Loving Frank. If anybody knows that book, it's about Mama Bosworth Cheney in Oak Park, and her relationship with Frank Lloyd Wright. It is fiction, I have to say. There is much in there that is not accurate, but it's a great book. It's so fun to read. And I remember reading that and thinking, oh, if only I knew an interesting person, I'm sure I could write a book like this, right? And then it occurred to me, hey, I know Edith, right? And because I'd written this zoo history book, and it starts with an unusual woman made Brookfield Zoo possible. And when I wrote the zoo history book, I did kind of, the first layer of research on Edith, which is, I gotta say, all the low-hanging fruit. It's the, child bride of King Tut, and it's the lost all the money and, blew through all this, and the divorce and the scandals and all of that. And as I began to research her, I realized how intellectual she was. And I realized things like the Infectious Diseases Institute and her work with Carl Jung and James Joyce and the opera and all of these things. And I began to wonder, why is it that nobody's ever heard of this woman? She did so much for Chicago, and yet we haven't heard of her. And so I did my research, and then I set out to write historical fiction, and I failed time and time and time again for many years. It wasn't until I sat down and wrote just a straight biography of Edith that it was immediately picked up, and it was all very quick and easy. And I believe now that I still think my historical fiction version was interesting. But I think that Edith's life was so unbelievable that in historical fiction form, you would be forced to think, oh, that can't be true. That part must be fiction. So in the end, I'm happy about how it turned out. It was published through Southern Illinois University Press, and they did a wonderful job making it better all along at every step in the process. And so grateful to them, and happy that Edith's life has now been recorded without any question of, is this fact or fiction?
Well, certainly an involved and varied story, as well as when you think about a woman of that time to do all of these things, you have to wonder, well, what if she had been a man? Would she have donated all that land? Or would she have called in the notes on the land that had been sold next to the zoo? How might her life have been different if she was a man?
Entirely different from the get-go. First of all, she would have been ushered into the Standard Oil business, as Junior was. And Junior fairly quickly and wisely decided to forego that and left Standard Oil in order to take up philanthropy as his main business. And Junior is really responsible for almost single-handedly restoring the Rockefeller name. So Edith would have been ushered into that world. There are a number of letters from her to her father while she was in Switzerland during those 8 years, saying things like, "I sometimes wish that you could forget that I am a woman, for everyone finds me very resembling you, and I am very capable, and I would like to help with family philanthropies," or, so on. But there was no gender equity in the House of Rockefeller. And while Junior was basically handed $400 million in the mid-teens to do with as he wished, the two remaining daughters were given the right to deal with the interest, but never to touch the principle of the money that they were given. So they had very limited ability in that respect.
Right.
So certainly very, very different.
Well, and I wonder how many of the so-called illnesses that the women suffered were due to the limited scope of their lives.
So I have come to believe that the illnesses, because the men were susceptible to these two. And I think there was a tremendous amount of pressure on this generation, because here's all the Rockefeller children were they were the children of a man who had revolutionized business almost single-handedly. And the McCormick children were the children of a man who had almost single-handedly revolutionized agricultural business.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do when you're Harold McCormick or Stanley McCormick, and you're destined for this life, and you're supposedly destined for greatness? It's a lot of pressure. And I think they all struggled with that, and some coped better than others.
Well, you mentioned that Edith had an idea about how to treat some illnesses that was different than what she was being told by the medical experts. And in fact, it was a very good idea, but no one pursued it because she was a woman.
Well, and that whole thing is maddening. So that was Catherine Dexter McCormick, who was Stanley's wife.
Okay.
And she was a biologist. I mean, she knew what she was talking about. But she was informed time and again by Stanley's doctors that no, we don't think this is endocrine related. And even so, it's too late to do any hormone treatments or anything on him. That won't be effective at this point in his life. Now, on the other hand, you've got his brother Harold, who decides, he wants to be more vigorous for his marriage to Ghana. And so he undergoes what? Hormone treatments. So just imagine how Catherine Dexter felt at that time. It must have been maddening.
Right.
Yeah. So I believe there's somebody working on a movie about Catherine Dexter McCormick, and I encourage you all to see that when that comes out. Probably won't be for a while. I know it's in progress, but she was an amazing woman who worked with Margaret Sanger and helped fund the birth control pill and Planned Parenthood, and she built a dormitory for female students at MIT, and I mean, just amazing woman.
We'll have to make a note of that.
Yes.
Did you find other Society Women of Chicago that you think were forgotten as you did your research on Edith?
Yes, I mean, there are very many. I'm working on another one right now. I don't want to jinx it by talking about it in public. But yeah, I mean, I think that people are really waking up to the fact that the history that we know is largely white male history, and that there's a lot more to be told out there, not only the women, but people of color and all the indigenous stories and so on. So much has been lost. So there's much to be told. Yes, so I'm working on something, and fingers crossed that.
Elaine Fisher, there are some questions.
We
in the
have a
chat.
question. We
Yeah.
have a question. Any connection to McCormick Place?
Yeah,
Between-
so good question. McCormick Place is named after Robert McCormick, the Colonel Robert McCormick. So in Edith's day and Harold's day, the Cyrus McCormick branch was the branch to be, because that's the Cyrus got the credit for the Reaper, whether it was deserved or not. I can't say. That's a whole debate that is still raging to this day. But Cyrus and his family got the vast majority of the money and the attention. But Robert McCormick, the Colonel, who most of you know from Chicago Tribune, he was the publisher of that. He played his cards right. And nowadays, most of the McCormick things that you see, whether it's McCormick Foundation or McCormick Place or Cantini out here in Wheaton, that is all named after Robert McCormick. And the Rockefeller McCormick strain has kind of gone quietly into history.
Well, here's another question. With all of her money, why couldn't Edith get a better lawyer for her divorce?
Oh, this is just maddening. Okay, so Edith's her tactic was, I'm not going to answer the phone. I'm not going to answer the door. I'm not going to answer my letters. I don't want a divorce. If I don't have any contact with Harold or his lawyers, then they can't force me. But Harold's brother-in-law, Parmalee Prentice, was a lawyer, and he and Edith's father and brother worked together to get her a lawyer. It was Judge Cutting, who I just recently found, in addition to being a judge, for a while he was the principal of Palatine High School. For any of you who live out in that direction, there's an auditorium called the Cutting Theater, which is named after him, and there's a big picture. But anyways, they set her up with Judge Cutting as her lawyer. And during the process of, all the negotiations, Judge Cutting was in contact with Junior and Senior, informing them of what's going on and Edith's state of mind and how he thinks that they should proceed, which I think is just highly unethical. and so they kind of railroaded her into this. There's correspondence between Junior and Senior Rockefeller regarding the settlement, and Junior saying something along the lines of, she made her bed. We're not going to help her with this. This is a result of the choices that she made, and she'll have to deal with it on her own, type of thing. The divorce was final right before Christmas, and for Christmas that year, as every year, Senior gave Harold his usual Christmas check. So Senior's relationship with Harold continued pretty much uninterrupted, despite this divorce and the fact that it had been Harold's plan all along.
Well, here's another question. Did you believe her connection to the zoo makes her more likable today? The history of the fortnightly in the 1970s, written through memories of other club women, mentioned that history had been very kind to Edith, to their surprise.
That's interesting. Well, so that it's a good question as far as why did she give the land that started Brookfield Zoo? Because I could not find any particular interest in zoos in her life. Her statement at the time to the reporters and so on was that we must study animals in order to come closer to the human soul. So it was born very much of her time with Carl Jung and her interest in the human psyche and the human soul. And she felt that research into animals and observing animals was the route to that. So that said, she donated the land, she had very little involvement beyond that. I don't believe she ever actually visited the zoo. It's possible she did, but there's no record of it. And she had a very difficult time traveling, even outside city limits. I mean, it was really tough for her. So I know that Harold came out and inspected the land and found it zoo worthy. But Edith was in Zurich when she donated the land. And many people believe that she donated the land in order to get rid of the back taxes that she owned on those lots in Riverside. So who knows? Both could be true. But it probably did help rehabilitate her image somewhat. And maybe there was some strategy behind that, hey, I'm coming back to the States. Maybe it's time to, maybe it's time to give Chicago a zoo. I don't know.
Well, how did writing about Edith change you? Is she still in your head?
She is still in my head. So, well, first, for many years, and my friends can attest to this, it made me pretty bitter because I was writing this really, really good historical fiction and nobody but me thought it was good. And I just got a lot of rejections, and that takes a toll. So it changed me in that respect. But then I think it changed me in two other important ways too. One is that Edith's story is really the story of the evolution of a woman, because she begins out, when she gets married and they have children, and she's, hostess extraordinaire in Chicago, with Napoleon's silverware and all this. She's writing all these newspaper articles about what a woman's role is. And the woman's role, it was four-pronged. And I can never remember the exact order, but it was children, husband, or maybe the other way around, I'm not sure. Children, husband, household, self, in that sort of order. So she really was very much into, my role is mother. But then she didn't really mother. She was a very absent mother. And later on in life, particularly after women gained the right to vote, with which she was not terribly involved, but she jumped on the bandwagon eventually. After that, she really began speaking out about what a woman can do and a woman's role, and how much that has changed, and how we can now be leaders in business and thought and education and all of this. So it was interesting to me to see her evolution and to ask myself about my own evolution. And I think that's very much true for women as they walk through life. Is, we have our different phases of life, and we really do evolve in our understanding of what it means to be a woman. And then the final thing that I learned from her came actually from my daughter, who was probably, I don't know, 9 or something when I first started researching this. And so one day we had nothing to do, and I said, "Oh, let's go to the cemetery. We're going to go visit Edith." That's the kind of mom I am. And so we went to Graceland, my daughter, my son, and I. And there is Edith's grave, and it's a really pretty simple grave, pretty elegant, with Jack and Editha near her. Then there's a pond, and then on the other side of the pond is the whole McCormick clan. So she's really kind of off by herself. And as I'm sitting there just pondering things, I noticed that Annie, little Annie at age 9, has plucked some dandelions and placed them on Edith's grave. And I thought, that right there is what Edith was missing in her life. That simple warmth, that simple kindness, that just sheer love from another human being. And I realized that, yeah, she was rich in many, many ways, but I am rich in a lot of different ways, and that I have the freedom to do what I want with my life without having, all these powerful men around me saying, no, this is the box you fit into. And I don't know, it made me feel good about my life in the end. So I'm grateful for that. That's a long answer. Sorry.
Nope, that's a good answer. One more question. What was it about Jungian analysis that attracted Edith, do you think? And did she continue any work related to that after she got back to Chicago?
Yes. So Jung wrote to a colleague a little bit later on in life that Edith was a case of latent schizophrenia when he first came across her, and that she was really ready to break. Whether that is true or whether he wrote that for some other purpose is that there are a lot of possible answers there. But there is no doubt that she was depressed about the death of 2 children, and that she'd begun having panic attacks, and her nervous system was just not keeping par. It was just not keeping up with her. So she needed something different. So she went over there, and then I think she kind of got stuck because travel was very difficult for her. Here comes World War I. Now travel's really difficult, right? Although her family members kind of managed to get back and forth remarkably often. But she was pretty content there. It's a good place to be, right? And she really believed in Jung's philosophies, and she thought that this was absolutely the way forward and that this would change the world. She was 100% a believer in his work. And then when she came back, her intent was to turn Villa Turicum into a psychoanalysis hotspot, where people could come and stay and be psychoanalyzed, and they could, she could help promote his beliefs and so on. Didn't quite turn out that way. She did continue to practice. She continued to see patients in the Bastion. She never took any money for it, but I think she enjoyed it very much. A big part of it was listening to dreams. And I think that Edith had issues with intimacy and with really divulging a lot of herself to other people. But I think that this relationship with her clients was perfect for her, because they poured out their innermost fears and anxieties and so on, and she was able to listen but didn't have to reciprocate.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's I did a program a little while ago with the C.G. Jung Institute in Chicago, and they kind of came to the conclusion that she was the first Jungian therapist in Chicago.
Oh,
That's kind of cool.
right.
So,
Right.
I also
Well, quickly. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I just see a comment in the chat about about the collaboration with Ellie Presents. And
Yes.
yeah, I want you all to keep an eye out for this, that I do a program with Ellie Carlson of Ellie Presents. It's the two of us together, where I'm the author and she is Edith. And it's really fun. As far as we know, we are the only people doing this kind of author interpreter presentation, but it really brings Edith's story to life. And Ellie is tremendously talented. So if you're interested in seeing her, you can check out her website, which is elliepresents.com.org, something like that. So yes, but it's really fun.
Ellie Presents. Well, if you Google it, you'll probably find it.
Yes, let's hope. Yes.
And it'll be nice to actually go to an in-person event.
Yes. Yeah.
So it'll probably be in the spring. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this amazing story with us. We certainly enjoyed it and appreciate it. And thank you for spending the evening with us.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I love talking about Edith, and I feel, as you can tell, I feel so strongly that her story should be heard. And so, I or Ellie and I would love to present.
Well,
it.
Andrea, before you go, you should tell us about your website, because you actually do talk about Ellie on your website. Tell us what the URL for your website is.
Yes, so I'm at you know what, let me put it in the chat, because
Good idea.
It's hard to period.com. Okay. It's www.friedericiross.com. So yeah, take a look there. I talk about my books and so on. But for more information about the program that I do with Ellie, it's best to go to her website and take a look at that. So,
There's
yeah.
another question, whether Edith ever met Jane Addams.
Oh, she did. They worked together on the 3 Arts Club. So I don't
yeah.
know. I don't know how close they were. I think that they were very different in personality, and that their interests overlapped, but were divergent enough that they probably weren't best buds. So that's I don't have any correspondence between the two of them, but I know that there was some significant overlap there.
Don't you think Jane might have found her more as a possible source of money because Jane needed funds for her projects? That
Yes.
would be the collaboration rather than somebody simpatico with bringing up the downtrodden in the city slums.
Yes, I think that's probably true, and I don't know. I think that Jane Addams had really. Well, I don't want this to sound wrong. She had really noble aspirations, and she may have kind of rolled her eyes a little bit at Edith. And I don't want that to sound wrong, because Edith did a lot of good, but it was very different than the sort of thing that Jane Addams did. Yes. Oh, I see there are still questions rolling in. Do you want me to keep? I'm happy to keep answering questions, or it's up to.
Sure, go
all of
ahead.
you.
And people, let me just quick share a little bit about the Shape the Future membership discount. We mentioned earlier that anyone who's interested in joining AUW can get a discounted rate if you have participated tonight. So we want to make sure that you remember that. And the way to do that is to go to our Jane Addams website. And we have a membership form there. You can complete that and mail it with your check to our branch. And the rate is $53.50, and that includes national, state, and the branch. So this would be for new members to AAUW. If you're already a member of another branch, you can become a dual member by just paying the $10 branch dues for Jane Addams. But this is any person who's new to AAUW, you are entitled to a discount. And if you need more information, we have our treasurer's address here, Kate Skegg at aauwjaneadams@gmail.com. So I wanted to mention that before people leave us. And this little reminder, it's very important to be vocal in your school board elections, park district, municipals. Don't think that this election doesn't matter. So thanks everyone, but let's go ahead and answer the questions. And if people need to leave, you can leave, but we'll go ahead and do the rest of the questions.
And one other thing about AAUW Jane Addams is all the programs are virtual.
Right. It's a virtual branch, Jane Addams.
So they're all Zoom meetings.
So you can live anywhere and join in.
Exactly.
Ellen's in Oregon tonight. She lives there.
Hi there.
So we have some questions. What was it exactly that the Rockefeller family objected to most about Edith's choices?
Yeah, and I'll just say for anybody who's checking out now, I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming tonight. I really appreciate that.
Right.
Yeah, well, Edith's family did not appreciate that she was gone for 8 years and that she was basically abdicating all her responsibilities at home and with her children, right? And particularly when Edith's mother died, that her father was very much bothered that Edith didn't come back for their 50th wedding anniversary, and then for her mother's death. And father also very much did not understand what Carl Jung was trying to do, and felt that she was kind of being lured away by a false god in a way, because she was abandoning her Baptist beliefs in favor of whoever this guy was over here in Switzerland, spouting all this new age stuff, right? So her father was very much disapproving. And then when she came back home, eventually she passed through New York, but she had Edwin with her, and they had a series of telegrams back and forth with her father, where she said, well, I'll be there tomorrow. And he said, no, unless it's just you coming, I think we should postpone the visit till another day. And they just went back and forth like that until finally she said, okay, I'm going home. I'll see you some other time. So she really kind of burned her bridges with father, and that just got worse as time went on. And then her children, I mean, she really, and this sounds harsh, but if you look at her record, she really wasn't there for them. She really wasn't a mother. Her daughter Mathilde was raised in the Davos sanatorium for 18 years almost, and Muriel was really raised by her governess, and Edith was not involved. And Fowler was back here at boarding school, and so they really didn't feel like she had invested anything in the relationship, and I think that came back to bite her later on. And as for Harold, I mean, Harold was kind of the polar opposite of Edith. Edith was an introvert and an intellectual, and Harold was outgoing and gregarious, and he loved a good party. And so they had been separated long enough with by the ocean that he had enough of a taste of this, I think. And once he met Ghana, he just thought, I can't do this anymore. I can't live this narrow lifestyle where, I'm just living for the Rockefeller branch. So yeah, I think it was a natural growth for Harold. I feel badly sometimes that Harold maybe doesn't come across well in these presentations. I think Harold was a decent guy, and I think the marriage probably wasn't a healthy thing for him in the long run either. So let's see, I see one other question here. While I know the generations conflicted, did she have any kind of interaction with Mrs. Potter Palmer? Were they neighbors on Lakeshore Drive? Bertha died in 1918. Yeah, so they did overlap a little bit. Bertha Palmer, of course, was, the queen of society here in Chicago for many, many years. And was very involved with the Columbian Exposition in 1893, which was really kind of, I think probably 1890s was the peak of her powers. And she was just kind of on her way out when Edith came in. And then, so they overlapped a little bit. Bertha Palmer died while Edith was in Switzerland. And then when Edith came back, her role here was different anyways. So yeah, very, very different types though, I think. So
Andrea,
yeah.
thank you so much for answering my question about what the Rockefellers objected to, because, I think a modern sensibility can't appreciate how, post women who run with the wolves, I don't think it's easy to appreciate how strange that must have seemed to them. So thank you for explaining.
Yes, and I mean, it was frustrating to me as I researched her, because she's always kind of the black sheep of the family, and I started out thinking, that actually she was really pretty crazy, because that's how she's portrayed and everything. But then when you read her correspondence and her writings, she doesn't come across as crazy at all. So, I mean, I think she, they really did their best to sideline her. And if it's true that they destroyed her papers after her death, which is very possible, particularly because the Rockefellers were trying to distance themselves from Dato and the debts that would come along with that. So they wanted to very much have their hands clean of all of that. But we lost all of Edith's journals that she would have done as part of her work with Carl Jung, and we lost all of her records of donations and all the patient records and everything. It's just all is gone, which is heartbreaking. But yeah, thank you for your comment. I appreciate that. How did they meet? Was it an arranged marriage? Yeah, so they met. Harold was in the private school that Senior had set up for Edith's brother Junior. So he really kind of became a member of their family. And Edith knew him from her early teens. So it was a very natural thing. And I believe Edith was very much in love with him. Even at the time of the divorce, she wrote to her father, I do not want this divorce, for I love him. Yeah, I mean, Harold moved on eventually, but I think that it was a love match early on.
Ellen, did you have a question?
Well, it's not a question, comment. I want to say that two things jump out at me. One is women like men need good mentoring, and if you don't get it at home, you seek professionals. And if you're not listening, that's a problem, probably. That's one thing. And the other thing, if someone wanted to get rid of you in your ideas that maybe went against the family ideas, they would try to institutionalize you. That was very common.
Yes.
And so those things jump out at me.
Yes,
Yeah, and the Jungian thing, going to Switzerland, that's what rich people did. It's a wonderful lifestyle. The hospitals are clean and forward thinking, so I'm not surprised at all that she would be going there. But
Right.
certainly helped Jung's career. That's kind of interesting, isn't it?
It certainly did, yes. And your point about institutions is very well taken, because had Harold been a different type of husband, he very much could have institutionalized her. Or completely shut her off. So, she had more leeway than some did, Yes. And then Diane asks, where did her treasures go? Did Chicago museums own any? Yeah, so they were all auctioned off, and they just went to the winds. Her library was auctioned off as well, and that at least has her book plates in it. So every now and then at auction, an Edith Rockefeller McCormick book comes up for auction, and that's kind of fun to see, where it's been in the meantime and the provenance of all those books. But it's a little bit harder with the furniture, and I mean they auctioned off everything. They took the siding off the walls and they tried to auction that off. It was a madhouse. The first auction was at Villa Turicum, and there were so many people there just to look, that several people fell in the fountain. They were pushed, and it was madness. And so then there was an entrance fee to get into the one at the Bastion, and there was a third auction in New York, and they sold some, but not a lot. And what they did sell was really sold for very small amounts of money. There is an example, at least one set of the Napoleon silverware at the Art Institute, and they have some of her laces as well. Barbara Hutton ended up with the Catherine the Great emeralds. So in fact, if you Google Edith Rockefeller McCormick images, you will often see Barbara Hutton. Or Ghana, she pops up sometimes too. So everything was really kind of scattered. The Cuneo estate up in Lake Bluff, I think it is. John Cuneo bought a number of pieces, so some are up there. But yeah, very much scattered. So very sad.
Such a shame.
Yeah. It's really kind of like Humpty Dumpty, where I'm trying to piece her back together based on all these little things that have been scattered to the winds.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you again. I think
Thank
we'll
you.
wrap up.
Yes,
It's been wonderful.
Well,
wonderful.
thank you all so
so
much for this. I appreciate it. And thank you for spending this February evening, this Groundhog Day evening here.
And thank you, Kate, for doing so much to make this happen. Thank you.
Very
Thank
much
you.
appreciated. All the work behind the scenes.
Thank you everyone for logging in. We had 51 people, I think, which was quite a good turnout.
Yes, lovely.
That's great.
lovely.
Yes.
That's wonderful. All right. I will say goodbye. So thank you
Thank
all.
you.
I appreciate it.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you and good
Thank
night.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Thank you.